Welcome again to this segment that I've begun to call Rules for the Way. I grew up in a small town in South Carolina. It was the best of times and the worst of times. It was the best of times because it was a relatively small world. Literally, you knew almost everyone in town by name and by their family connections. There were times when it was comforting to know that I was known in our little town as Posey Smith's grandson and as Foster Broom's son. It was also the worst of times because it was such a small world that everyone thought they knew everyone else's business or wanted to know the good and the bad and the ugly, which means we were always watching everyone closely for some indiscretion, from some failure, from any number of public sins that helped us conceal our very private sins. It also meant that I was guilty by association, and I was forced to carry the guilt and shame of every notorious sinner in my family from generations past. At times, even the church I grew up in, it seemed to me that we were more interested in exposing each other's sins than loving one another. It seemed to me across the years that the religious subculture I grew up in was fixated on sin, sinning, and sins. No matter how long we had been on the journey of faith, we still referred to ourselves as sinners. I became an adult before I even dared to believe that I might be a beloved child of God. It took a long time before I began to see that Jesus offered me other ways of seeing myself and others. Not only did He offer me alternatives, but He was a living example that one did not have to be fixated on sin, always prepared to judge sin, and always ready to condemn sinners. Even though in my little religious party, we didn't pay much attention to Jesus when He said, "Do not judge and do not condemn," even if it meant we would not be judged or condemned, we just couldn't help ourselves when it came to pointing out the sins of other folks. Across the years, I've gone back time and time again to that last night on Jesus' life for proof of another way. Sitting at the table with Jesus on that night were His best friends on earth. And before dawn of the next day, one would betray Him, one would deny Him 3 times, and they all would abandon Him. Yet, as John begins his narrative of the last night of Jesus' life, he writes, "Having loved His own who were in the world, He loved them to the end." He loved them to the end despite their failings. This way of Jesus brought me to rule number 3 for the journey. Love covers a multitude of sins. It took me quite a while to embrace this rule. I first found these words buried deep in the New Testament. You know, everyone reads the letters of Paul, but whoever bothers to spend much time with the letters of Peter? Yet old Peter writes, "Above all, maintain constant love for one another, for love covers a multitude of sins." I wonder if Peter is speaking from his own experience. His denial of Jesus devastated him. He had convinced himself that he would never do such a thing. When Jesus repeatedly asked him, "Simon, do you love me?" Simon was exasperated. Simon only turned to be Peter the rock once he accepted that Jesus' love for him had covered his denial. Yes, it is love that enables us to see one another in a different light. Love that keeps us from holding the sins of those we love against them. With the war going on in Ukraine, I am rereading the memoirs of Elie Vasel, who survived the Nazi concentration camps at the age of 16 and shared his experience in his book, Night. After the Jews of his hometown had been driven into the ghetto, Vasel wrote, "It was in the ghetto that I truly began to love the Jews of my town. Throughout the ordeal, they maintained their dignity as human beings and as Jews. Imprisoned, reduced to subhuman standards, they showed themselves still capable of spiritual greatness. Against the enemy they stood as one, affirming their faith in their faith. Yes, I know very well that a community cannot be judged on its behavior over just a few weeks. But this is not a question of judgment, but of love. And I do love them, the Jews of my town, the Jews of the ghetto. It is love that empowers us to see one another differently. Love enables us to acknowledge that we are all sinners, and loved by God, we are forgiven through that love. Love reminds us that Jesus did not come to condemn us, but to save us. It is love that seeks to shun judgment by seeking to understand. It is love that inspires justice and compassion, which will not allow condemnation. Even though I still cannot grasp all the possible meanings of Peter's words, I am convinced of the truth of rule number 3 and the power of rule number 3. Love covers a multitude of sins. When we let Jesus' love do its work in us, as it did in Simon Peter, we learn to love as we have been loved. This love empowers us to forgive as we have been forgiven. And soon, I think we forget about sins altogether when we have learned to love our neighbor, our enemy, and the stranger. This evening, let us take a few moments to meditate on the power of love to cover a multitude of sins, so we may learn to love in this way. Lord Jesus, reveal to me the love that empowered you to love your friends who betrayed you, denied you, and abandoned you. Lord Jesus, teach me to love as you love. Lord Jesus, as you suffered on cross, how were you able to pray, Father, forgive them? Lord Jesus, teach me how to forgive others as you have forgiven me. Lord Jesus, how were you able to look past the woman caught in adultery to see the hypocrisy of the men who wanted to stone her? Lord Jesus, make me intensely aware of my own sins so I may resist the temptation to judge or condemn another person. Lord Jesus, help me to grasp the deeper meaning of the phrase, love covers a multitude of sins. And so we go on along the way, carrying a few rules in our pocket to help us when things get tough. So tonight, let us remember, love covers a multitude of sins. Thank you.